Recording. All right. There we go. Just want to let everybody know that we are recording this so that those that aren't able to make it tonight will be able to listen in. And this is actually how I found Ryan. Was in a YouTube video. He was presenting, I think it was to the engineers, right? Professional engineers, and
The
so forth.
Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers,
Yeah.
of which I'm very much not one, but yes, I was presenting to them.
It was awesome. I had to, when I heard it, I'm like, we got to bring this in. This is so good. Okay, so let me introduce myself. I'm Jody Chen. I'm the VP of Programs and Events for LA County Asian American Employees Association, LASEAS for short. I've been looking forward so much to this evening's webinar on transforming your lives, overcoming toxic invisibility. I'm so glad you're all here. And I have mentioned if you're willing to, introduce yourself in the chat box, please feel free to do so. So quite often we're so busy with our lives, juggling so many different priorities. We don't often sit down and think about how we're doing mentally. So for AAPI Heritage Month, as well as a Mental Health Awareness Month, we put together this workshop to help you begin this journey of self-awareness and healing. After this workshop, if there's interest in doing a deeper dive on this topic, or if you have other mental health related topics that you'd like to hear about, please let me know. Ryan has a lot to unpack in a short amount of time. So if you have any questions for our speaker, please put them in the chat. We want to encourage your questions, so we'll try to address as many as possible today. That also means that we need to be disciplined about making sure everyone is on mute, with the exception of our speaker, of course. So also, please, I mentioned about the recording, and just want to make sure that you guys are all aware. And so anyway, so without further ado, let me introduce Ryan. Ryan Takemiya is a writer, community leader, and storyteller who works as an executive diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging consultant, providing human-centered DEIB solutions for organizations of all sizes. Specializing in AAPI identity and culture, his mission is to empower AAPIs and their allies with the agency to transform themselves, their workplaces, schools, and societies at large in order to overcome what he calls toxic invisibility. Okay, Ryan, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Jody, so much for putting this event together. I'm really happy to be here speaking to you all this evening. And thank you so much again for joining us in the evening time. I know that this is kind of the only time we can do this. So I really, really appreciate you all taking the time. Thank you. So yeah, as I'm going along, feel free to put questions in the chat. I tend to sort of black out a little bit while I talk. So if I miss your question, please forgive me. Jody's going to try and help me out by interrupting me if there is a question, or we can ask your questions at the end. No problem at all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I don't want you to stare at my face the entire time. We're going to look at some pretty slides here. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and present that. This is an introduction to my workshop called Overcoming Toxic Invisibility. And this is it's very exciting. I'm very excited to bring this to you because this is kind of a new term, this term overcoming toxic invisibility, which I know you haven't heard of before because I coined it and you haven't heard of me before. So I'm sure you haven't heard of it. But I would love to, I'm excited to sort of explain what it means and what I mean by it, and just to introduce some thoughts and ideas that I had with you all. And I would love to hear your feedback and to sort of pick through it together as a group, because I don't consider myself an authority on these matters at all. I just consider myself someone who has an interesting idea that I'd like to share. And also, my daughter is going to chime in every now and then as well. So, but before we get started, let's breathe. Let's breathe together, because this is Mental Health Awareness Month, as well as Asian American Heritage Month. And so we would, of course, I would be remiss if we didn't start with some good mental health work, some good grounding exercises. It's the end of the day. You've probably all just got home from work or just signed off or just put away your your work for the day. And we all know that work can be incredibly stressful. Oftentimes we have very little time before moving on to the next thing before we can actually take a moment to stop and breathe and collect ourselves. So let's take that moment. Let's just do that before we get started. I'm going to do a quick little exercise with you all. This is called square breathing. This is something that's done to help calm the nervous system. It's very simple. We're just going to breathe, but in addition to breathing, we're going to count as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to count. Don't worry, you don't have to count very high. All you have to do is count to 4. What you're going to do is you're going to breathe in through the nose. And as you're breathing in through your nose, you're going to count to 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And when you count to 4, then you're going to hold that breath. And as you hold that breath, you're also going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, holding the breath. And then you exhale through the mouth. And as you exhale, you're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4 in the exhale, and then hold the exhale for 1, 2, 3, 4 before we start the next inhale again. We're going to do this 3 times. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. 3 whole times. Now, your cameras are all off. You're all on mute. I don't know if you're actually doing this, and that's okay. That's totally fine. You can do it or not do it. That's up to you, but I highly encourage you to try it just because it's going to become important later on. So with me, let's all count together, starting on the inhale through the nose. Ready and inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. And exhale through the mouth. 2, 3, 4. And hold. 2, 3, 4. Again, inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. And hold. 2, 3, 4. And exhale. 2, 3, 4. And hold. 2, 3, 4. Again, last time. Inhale. 2, 3, 4. And hold. 2, 3, 4. And exhale. 2, 3, 4. And hold. 2, 3. And release and go ahead and breathe normally. That's an exercise that helps calm the nervous system. You can use that anytime you're feeling overwhelmed, you're feeling rattled, or just like you are having sort of a moment where you're freezing up or incredibly stressed out. That can sort of help bring you back to focus and bring you back to reality, especially the counting portion of it, right? So breathing, taking deep breaths is one thing, and that doesn't always help situations, but the counting serves as a function to help us focus on something that we can control, right? We can control our breath, we can control our counting. So just doing that little tiny exercise can help a little bit in calming the nervous system. Thank you for trying that with me. As Jody mentioned, I'm a writer, community leader, and workshop facilitator. And I come to this diversity, equity, inclusion work not from an academic background or even a corporate background. Like I said, I'm really not an authority on these matters. I come to this work from a background in community organizing and a long time background in community organizing here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I think that's important because I come to you today not with top-down solutions, right? I'm not coming here today saying that your executive leadership needs to do this, these policies need to change, you need to change these hiring practices, structural stuff, right? That's very important. That stuff is very important, and we need to enact those changes. However, those changes can often take a long time. Structural changes, as we know, can take a long time to take effect and take a long time to trickle down to everybody, all of us on the ground floor who, as Asian Americans, we may need change sooner rather than later. We are feeling rather unseen and unheard. So I come to this work with a more humanist, bottom-up approach. And that approach is informed by my years of working in the community, by my background in the arts and the humanities. And so I am here to provide tools for folks that will help you be seen and heard and better understood right now, right this moment. I'm going to talk about things that could potentially help you right now, you and your coworkers. You could get together in organizations like the one you're in to help each other be seen and heard tomorrow. So this is the difference. And again, this comes from my work in the community. A long time ago, I created this Asian American creative community called Rama that was all centered around the arts and around promoting creativity and promoting, uh, you know, expression among young Asian Americans. The idea was that, Asian Americans, we aren't often encouraged by our parents or our, especially by immigrant parents to pursue creative fields or to even be creative in general. We're often encouraged or sometimes forced to pursue careers that are more quote unquote successful, right? So I spent many, many years working with young Asian Americans, trying to encourage them to just be creative wherever they are, whatever field they're in, whether that's medicine or it's law or engineering, to still take creativity, to still bring creativity into your field. I also spent many, many years trying to convince Asian Americans that their experiences of racism in this country are tied up with the experiences of racism of other people of color in this country as well, and that we all share, these experiences of being affected by American racism. However, over the years, I found a lot of difficulty in convincing a lot of Asian Americans that our struggles were bound up with those of others. And I think that a lot of it had to do with the language that we were using as activists. We were trying to convince Asian Americans that their struggle was tied to other struggles by using the language of other struggles. And that language kind of felt a little bit alien to some Asian Americans. We use language in terms such as disenfranchisement, police brutality, right? These terms, a lot of Asian Americans, not all Asian Americans could really identify with these terms and identify with these experiences. And that's when I realized that although our experiences are tied with other communities of color, our experience is somewhat different. And I wanted to look for the language to express that. So I was working with a couple of Asian American psychotherapists here in the Bay Area, my good friend Stephanie Lee, working to develop workshops to help Asian Americans heal and help them develop a better sense of identity. And she gave me this term, toxic. This is a term that's used often in therapy to describe behavior, right? We've heard of toxic behavior. Perhaps you've heard of toxic masculinity. And the idea behind the word toxic is, we use that in therapy because it's to denote that whatever the behavior is poisonous, both to everyone, both to the victim and the perpetrator, right? So toxic masculinity affects both women and men in negative ways, right? When something is toxic, it is pervasive, it permeates. And so I found that really fascinating, this toxic term. And then as I was working with Asian Americans here in the Bay Area, but also speaking to Asian Americans across the country, I started to realize that although we may not all experience police brutality, though we may not all experience disenfranchisement or exclusion from higher education, et cetera, the one thing that we do experience across the board is being rendered invisible. And now we have a very diverse community. Our community is incredibly diverse. We come from dozens of different countries, speak dozens of different languages. We have come here come to the United States under many different circumstances. And so our community is incredibly diverse, and there are no two experiences alike. However, no matter where you go in this country, and whether you are speaking to a first generation Asian American on the East Coast, or a second generation Asian American in the South, the Deep South, or in the Midwest, or even a fifth generation, half Japanese, half Chinese American from the San Francisco Bay Area, one experience that we can all identify with is this experience of being excluded from various different spaces and in various different ways, but excluded to the point where we feel invisible, right? And so we feel like we've been rendered invisible. And not only that, but we feel like we are either rendered invisible or we are rendered so visible it is to be visible in a negative way, right? So in the past few years, we've seen Asian Americans experiencing hate crimes like we haven't seen in many generations, right? Ever since the start of COVID-19, Asian Americans have been feeling not just invisible but unsafe. And in fact, now we are only second only to African Americans in feeling unsafe because of who we are, because of our race, as you can see on the upper right there. We feel most unsafe out in public, literally out on the streets and in public transportation. Basically, our invisibility has gotten to the point where our exclusion has got to the point where we feel like we're being violently excluded from American society. So this, and it's not just out on the street. I'm sure you felt it. You felt this feeling when you're out on the street. People either ignore you or they look at you with derision. And it's not just out on the street, it's in our schools, right? Asian Americans in schools, in high schools, higher education as well, we're feeling alienated and invisible. And, it's like you don't really need these studies to prove it because I think, we can just prove it based on firsthand accounts from any, most Asian Americans that you speak to. And it's not just in schools, but of course it's in the workplace as well. I don't have to tell you all, but I'm sure you've experienced at least some microaggressions here and there. But no matter whether or not you felt it yourself personally, you can't deny that the studies show that on the whole, Asians and Asian Americans feel less included and less accepted in the workplace. In fact, we feel the least included in the workplace, according to Bain and Company and also McKinsey and Company. The chart on the left shows that we are scoring very low in terms of feeling included in things like decision making, in things like being protected, or in things like being treated impartially, or having access to resources, right? So all in all, this sort of combines to create a situation where Asian Americans are the least likely to feel like they belong in the country as a whole, right? So not just in schools, not just in the workplace, and not just on the street, but everywhere we go, just in the country. We just feel least like we belong in the entire country. This is a study that was done by the Asian American Foundation that found that Asians only responded 22% when asked if they feel like they belong and are accepted in the United States. So this invisibility that we experience, it's everywhere. It's not just in the workplace or in schools. It follows us when we walk down the street. It follows us even into our homes. It follows us even when we're alone, when there's nobody around to render us invisible. We still feel invisible and we feel like we're not accepted or we don't belong in the United States. And that's why this invisibility is toxic. That's why I call it toxic invisibility, because I think this term really encapsulates the common Asian American experience in this country. Again, no matter what part of the country where you're from, or what generation you are, or how you got here, you feel some kind of invisibility somewhere at some point in your life. So that's maybe that's triggering to you. I don't know. Maybe hearing all these stats and seeing all these things is bringing up some emotions for you. If it is, I'm going to take another breath break and I want to do another exercise with you, a different exercise this time. Again, you don't have to do this. It's totally optional. It's up to you, but I would love for you to join me in taking a few deep breaths. But this time, what we're going to do is we're going to do something called self-soothing. Self-soothing is an exercise that's commonly done in therapy. Uh, it's a somatic exercise, meaning that it's physical and it connects the brain with the body. So what we're going to do is, if you're sitting down in a chair, I'd love for you to make sure that your feet are planted firmly on the floor, flat, but firmly on the floor. And this exercise works best when you close your eyes, but you don't have to, of course. And what I would love for you to do is, I'd love for you to take your hands and you're going to put your hands your on your thighs. You can't see my thighs, but I'm putting my hands on my thighs, on the sides of my thighs, right? And as I breathe, as I take deep breaths, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my hands in a sort of a circular motion on the outside of my thighs. I'm going to basically be rubbing the outside of my thighs. I'm going to do it very slowly, rub them very slowly, kind of in the way that if you were giving someone a hug, like a good friend was very sad and they came to you and they needed a hug, and you patted them on the back and you rubbed their back, right? So I want you to do that on your thighs with your hands very slowly as you take a few deep breaths. Go ahead and close your eyes. Let's take 3 deep breaths, just in through the nose and out through the mouth. And go ahead. Rubbing your thighs nice and slow, like you're comforting a friend. Last breath. Excellent. Now, what I'd love for you to do is take your hands and sort of wrap them around yourself in what we call a self hug. Essentially, I don't know if you can see, but my arms are wrapped around myself. My hands are on the outside of my arms, and we're going to breathe again. This time, you're going to rub again, but you're going to rub the outside of your arms up and down, just like this. Again, like you're giving someone a hug and soothing them, but the person is you, right? So let's take 3 deep breaths again. Ready? And 1, 2, and 3. Excellent. That's what we call a self-soothing exercise. Again, the idea is that the person you're soothing is you. This can be done anytime, again, if you're feeling overwhelmed or if you're feeling stressed out, like you've hit a breaking point, or you feel like you're reacting very negatively to something that maybe somebody said to you or an email or whatever it is, and you need to calm the nervous system, you need to regulate. You can just sit in a chair and do that and you're essentially giving yourself a hug. That's all it is. Very, very simple, right? Okay, moving on. So this toxic invisibility that follows us wherever we go, it's pervasive, it's insidious. So how on earth can we overcome it? Well, in order to overcome it, we must first understand it. And I have broken it out into 3 parts, 3 elements. There is first the uh, being rendered invisible by others, or what you might call external invisibility, right? Misperceptions that people have of us, myths and preconceived notions that folks might have of us and our cultures. Then there is the internal invisibility, right? Internal psychological invisibility, the negative self-perception that we have, the psychological hangups that we have about ourselves. And then, of course, there are cultural misperceptions or cultural forces of invisibility. Culture clashes, basically, when 2 cultures collide and one tends to drown out the other one can be rendered invisible. I have broken toxic invisibility down to these 3 elements, and I want to go through those really quickly. So when someone is uh, rendering you invisible externally, what's usually happening is they are seeing you in an incorrect way. They are maybe even dehumanizing you through the way they see you or the way they misperceive you. They're basically getting the wrong idea, making assumptions, believing that they know who you are or what you are before you have a chance to explain yourself. This can be done in many different ways. Usually, this is a result of a handful of myths that people have about our community. These myths are deep-seated and hard to get rid of. Myths like the model minority myth, myths like the myth of the perpetual foreigner, right? The idea that we're all foreign and that we will always be foreign. Myths of the Asian monolith, the idea that we're all the same, right? So these things can express themselves in like ways as simple as someone assuming something about your culture or assuming something about you based on some fake idea that they have about Asians, right? Oh, you're all good at math, right? I mean, I know you're all good at math, right? Because you are, right? That's a myth. That's a myth about our community, and we've all heard that one. That's when someone is sort of erasing your identity and replacing it with one that they already have of you, right? So that's the external force of invisibility. Uh, then there's the internal. So it's not just other people. We aren't just rendered invisible by others. We often then help things along by rendering ourselves invisible psychologically. And what I mean by this is, I mean that we have Asian Americans, we are cursed with a number of different um, experiences that leave us with things like a lot of fear and shame and guilt. You know, as children of immigrants and as immigrants who came to this country oftentimes under great duress, under dire circumstances, often escaping war, famine, political persecution, we've experienced a lot of trauma. And that trauma doesn't just go away, it stays with us, it sticks with us for the long term. And sometimes we even transfer it onto our kids, right? There's intergenerational trauma. That trauma causes us to act differently than we probably normally would. It makes us fearful. It makes us think in terms of survival, makes us think in terms of black and white. Like either there are resources or there are not resources, and we tend to think of it in terms of there are not enough resources to go around. This is this this is basically what we call a scarcity mindset that a lot of immigrants, not just Asian American immigrants, but immigrants in general, tend to develop as a direct result of the trauma they've experienced just getting here to this country. And then, of course, once we get here, our situations don't always necessarily improve. And we are often, a lot of us are, a lot of large portions of our community are trapped in cycles of poverty and environmental injustice. And we are also exposed to a lot of racial violence in our communities. And so we're oftentimes under attack. And so when you're constantly under attack, not only have you escaped war and trauma, but then you come to this country and then you're under a different kind of attack, you can further develop these psychological processes. And these things, this fear, this anxiety, this self-criticism, this causes us to then remove ourselves from certain aspects of society. It causes us to self-censor, right? It might even cause us to not talk when we really feel like we want to talk, or not participate when we really actually want to participate or should participate, right? So we are rendered invisible even in our own minds. So that's not great. And then, of course, there's the cultural aspect. Now, this is a bit more complex, but this is less talked about these days, and how cultures can actually serve to erase other cultures. Basically, when you have two cultures in a room and one culture is more dominant, there are more people who are participating in that culture. Through no malice of forethought, that dominant culture sometimes has a tendency to drown out the voices of the other cultures in the room, right? It's not always on purpose. It's not always meant to be uh, it's not always meant to be rude or violent, but it sometimes can be, right? So perfect example of this is in the American workplace, in the American boardroom, right? In the meeting room. In America, American workplace culture is to speak loudly, to speak forcefully, to interrupt others, to speak over others. Literally, just the American style of conversation, the cultural forms of conversation make it so that conversation is supposed to be a quick back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, almost like a game of tennis, right? If you imagine a game of tennis, each player hitting the ball and hitting it right back to the other person right when it gets to them and hitting it right back to the other person very, very fast. Boom, 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 boom. This stands in direct contradiction with many different forms of Asian culture and Asian cultural forms of conversation and speaking in groups and speaking with strangers, especially, right? You might even say that Asian conversational style, especially, I don't know, I mean, I can really only speak for my cultures, but especially Japanese conversation, especially with strangers, is much more like a game of bowling, where when you bowl, one person stands up, takes their time to make their point, bowls, we all watch to see how it plays out, and then they take a seat, and then the next person gets up and takes their turn, right? So these two cultures are completely different. They're, in fact, quite the opposite. And so what happens is when there are more Americans in the room, the American conversational style wins out. And people talk over each other and they interrupt each other and it's like back and forth, back and forth. Meanwhile, the Asian Americans in the room may be waiting for a turn, maybe waiting for a moment to jump in, but they're waiting for a pause and they're waiting to make sure that everybody else has spoken. They're waiting and waiting, waiting, or they're maybe even waiting to be asked, waiting to be called on. But that opportunity a lot of times never comes. And then we're seen as quiet and submissive simply because we operate under a different cultural norm. And it's difficult when you've been raised and brought up with that cultural norm to switch to a completely other one, to a completely different one, right? To code switch between those two. It can be difficult for some of us. Maybe easy for some, but difficult for others, right? So this is how cultures can clash and drown each other out. Because Asian Americans are so few in the room sometimes, our style of conversation takes a back seat and we are rendered invisible and sort of maybe even silenced in a few ways, in a lot of ways, due to that. So if those are the three elements of toxic invisibility, external invisibility, internal invisibility, and cultural invisibility, we must develop strategies to address each one. I have developed strategies that I believe will address each one of these. I want to share them really quickly with you right now. But of course, I go much more in depth uh, I have a much more in-depth workshop that really delves into each one of these three strategies, but I will quickly go over them right now. Let's start with the internal. So this is very complicated chart. You don't have to read this whole thing. This is something else that I got from my psychotherapist friends. Let's talk about the internal stuff, the psychological stuff, what's going on inside your mind. This is a chart that describes what happens when we, as human beings, are presented with a situation when we feel our needs are being threatened. It used to be that this is what would happen when we felt our lives were being threatened in the wild in prehistoric times. But now, because of modernity, this survival mechanism still kicks in, but it really but it happens even when our lives aren't being threatened, but when we feel like our needs are being threatened. So what happens is whenever you feel your needs being threatened, or when you feel like you're being erased or rendered invisible, your body actually goes into a physiological stress response. You may have heard of it. It's called the fight, flight, or freeze response. It's very natural. It's a natural evolutionary survival mechanism that we've had for millions of years, and it has helped us survive things like lions, tigers, and bears. But now it gets triggered a lot because we don't face lions and tigers and bears. We now face angry bosses, angry emails, and stressful situations, and it still gets triggered. So what happens is that your body releases a bunch of adrenaline and cortisol into your bloodstream instantaneously, I should mention. This all happens very fast, which causes you to breathe faster, causes your heartbeat to increase, which pumps more oxygenated blood to your limbs and your extremities, preparing you to either fight what's threatening you or run away from it, or in extreme situations, to freeze up and preserve essential bodily functions. So your body kind of shoots up into this really strong physical reaction, internal physical reaction, and you exist in this space of fight, flight, or freeze until the threat or perceived threat is gone. And then your body has natural ways of deactivating and regulating itself, but those take time. And it may not happen quickly, but it takes time. And, as Asian Americans, as people of color in this country, we are faced with many situations where we feel our needs are being threatened. So you may experience microaggressions multiple times a day, or even macroaggressions on a near constant basis, depending on where you live. Sometimes you might even experience aggression out on the street, right? And these experiences send you into this fight, flight, or freeze response. But then sometimes, and this is especially true for African Americans who live under constant threat of racial violence, the body doesn't have time to deactivate before the next experience happens. And then for Asian Americans, even though we may not face a lot of as much racial violence, outright racial violence as African Americans, we have that internal stuff going on, right? So the psychological stuff going on where we feel a bunch of shame for in our daily lives, and that even the shame and the guilt and the psychological factors sometimes send us right back into that fight, flight, or freeze response. That's what that yellow arrow circle is, right? Sometimes we don't even have time to get out of it when we're sent right back into it. So we, people of color, Asian Americans, we are often caught in a nonstop cycle of stress and of racial stress. So what we need to do to address the internal forces of invisibility and this internal stuff that's going on is we need to heal. We absolutely need to heal. This is why I've been introducing to you grounding exercises over the course of this presentation. Right? So the best thing that we could do for ourselves as individuals is therapy, but not everybody has the time or the money or the resources for therapy. So in lieu of that, there are things that we can do as individuals to help ourselves, to help regulate our own emotions, regulate our own nervous systems, right? No, we don't all have time to gather in healing circles and speak with each other and support each other. Oftentimes, our support systems are fragmented and few and far between, right? We barely have time to go from work to dinner to going to bed. But there are some activities that you can do as an individual on your own in short amounts of time that will help you start to understand your own physiological responses and help you calm them and control them. The first two breathing exercises I gave you are just the tip of the iceberg for these types of exercises. I have a whole workshop on these healing modalities that I was given by Stephanie Lee and a couple of other Asian psychotherapists that I would love to share with you all, especially this being Mental Health Awareness Month. But these are the things that we need to work on. These are things that would be incredibly useful for us as we go through life. Now, the external forces of invisibility, right? So we are rendered invisible by people's misperceptions of us. And for and a lot of people think that education is the key to addressing the external forces that render us invisible, right? So if people have myths or misperceptions about our community, well, we need to bust those myths and give them the numbers, give them the actual data. Well, here's the data, and I want you to take a look at it. There's been a call for the government to disaggregate the data, right? To look at Asian Americans not as a monolith, but as a diverse community of dozens of different cultures and languages. And when you do that, because when you do that, you find that it busts all of the myths all at once, right? So the model minority myth is the myth that we're all doing well. Well, if you look at this chart, you realize that we're not all doing well. Large numbers of us have less than a high school diploma, or are unemployed, or are below the poverty rate. Large portions of us don't even have health insurance, right? So we're not doing well, and we're not all doing the same, right? It's rather varied. It runs the gamut, actually. Uh, in fact, Asian Americans have the highest within group income inequality in the United States. So more than any other community, our community is incredibly varied. And when it comes to things like income and education and health. So just showing people the data is important, right? This is important. But we've shown people data, and it's not going to be your job. It shouldn't be your job to educate those who are miseducated about us. You shouldn't have to go around with a chart in your back pocket showing everybody that we're all different and that we all have these different disparities. That shouldn't be your job. That should happen. It should be somebody's job. It should be the government's job. But you as an individual, working with your coworkers who may have misperceptions about you and your culture, it's not your job to go around educating everybody, because that's exhausting. It's exhausting, and you may not be an educator. It may not be natural to you. But you know what is natural to you, and you know what actually is more powerful than pure data is stories. Telling stories. And before you roll your eyes and log off because I said the word stories and storytelling, I want you to know that this is not the type of storytelling that you might hear about on social media. The storytelling is a buzzword right now. It's a big fad right now. But I'm not talking about that type of storytelling. I'm talking about storytelling, the type of storytelling that we all know how to do intrinsically, because we are born natural storytellers. In fact, we have been ever since the beginning of language, right? Ever since language was invented, humans have been telling stories. And no one can say, "Oh, I'm not a storyteller," because you are. It is our natural language. It is the way we speak to each other. We speak to each other in story, in narrative, right? And so you, as a human being, as a natural storyteller, you have a story to tell because you live life. You get out of bed every day and you experience things. And so naturally you have stories about your day, stories about your life, stories about your experiences. And those stories are real because they are your story, right? And if you just share those stories, if you were to just share those stories with people, with the people around you, your coworkers, your community, uh, when you share those stories, it changes people's minds. It has the power to change minds. It has the power to encourage empathy. It has the power to validate your experience and humanize you in the eyes of your listener. So I advocate for people to tell stories, to combat the external forces of invisibility and the misperceptions that people have of us. And again, I have a whole workshop on storytelling because it is a skill that you have lost. We've all sort of lost it. And that's why you think you're not a good storyteller, but you are. You just have to tap it back into that storytelling skill that you have deep down inside. Lastly, I know we're running short of time, so I want to go over this quickly. The cultural forces of invisibility, right? How do we address that when the dominant culture drowns out other cultures, when our culture is rendered invisible? Some say the solution is for the dominant culture to learn about other cultures, right? They should learn how other cultures work so that they can be more sensitive to it. This is called cultural sensitivity training. And that's important too, sure. But just being sensitive to other people's culture does not necessarily create a situation where the minority cultures can feel comfortable, because the dominant culture is now thinking about them, but they're not. But now you feel like you've been put in the spotlight, and you feel like you're being treated specially or whatever, special treatment, right? It just feels weird, right? It feels strange. What if there was a situation where we could actually create an atmosphere where all cultures in the room feel seen and heard and feel like we are participating in their cultures, that we are enacting their cultures in the room, and no culture feels left out? I believe that that's possible. And I believe it is possible through this process that I call cultural synthesis. The idea is that you take one culture, you take another culture, you take elements of both, you combine them to create a third culture that didn't exist before, but that is completely new, but that contains elements of the cultures that came before it, right? So we all exist in these spaces that have multiple cultures in them, just purely by being in America, right? Whatever your group is, whatever your cohort is, if you were able to take all the cultures in that cohort and mix them in a blender and create a new culture, a new way of doing things, a new way of operating, what would that look like? What would that be? So I brought the example before of meetings, right? Of Asian Americans being drowned out or silenced in meetings because of the way that Americans have conversation. So instead of saying, "Hey, Americans, you need to stop what you're doing and you need to hide your culture away so that other cultures can thrive," and instead of saying to the Asian people, "Hey, you need to ditch all of your Asian culture and participate in American culture and just get in there and chop it up and be aggressive," right? That would be asking both sides to not be themselves. Instead of that, what if we were to ask both sides to contribute forms of their culture that made a new form, that made a new way of doing things, a new way of running meetings? What if, for example, instead of leaving everything up to chance and just speaking willy-nilly and then ending the meeting, what if you had your meeting as normal and people talked over each other and interjected ideas, but at the end of the meeting, what if you had a roll call where you just took an extra few minutes to go down the list of everybody in the room and ask and point it and ask each person, "Joe, did you have everything? Did you say everything you wanted to say? Jane, did you say everything you wanted to say? Heather, have you said everything you wanted to say? Josh, have you said everything you wanted to say?" That way, it gives the Asian Americans in the room the opportunity to be called on, to have their turn to speak without having to interrupt anyone, without having to change themselves, without having to be aggressive and get in there and chop it up, right? They get to speak in a way that is culturally comfortable for them, right? So we're not asking anybody to put away their culture. We're asking both cultures to contribute some kind of form of being into this one form. Now, these are the three strategies that I present and that I would love to go more in depth to um, in a future workshop, hopefully, if you'll have me back. Healing to address the internal invisibility, storytelling to address the external invisibility, and cultural synthesis or cultural improvisation or cultural creativity or cultural agency, whatever you want to call it, the power to change culture. All these three things working in tandem to overcome that toxic invisibility. One last grounding exercise I want to leave you with. This one is called 5-4-3-2-1 grounding. Once again, totally optional. But again, if you're sitting, make sure your feet are planted firmly on the floor. And take your hands, just put them on tops of your thighs, and just make sure that you are sitting straight up. And what you want to do is you're going to take a moment to look around you and notice 5 things that you can see. 5 things that you can see. So point out, just look at 5 things in the room around you that you can see. And as you look at those things, describe them to yourself. What color are they? What shape are they? What texture do you think they might be? Just notice 5 things in the room that you can see. Now, without getting out of your chair, notice 4 things in the room that you can touch, and go ahead and touch them. Touch 4 things in the room. Maybe you're touching a laptop. Maybe you're touching your mug that's sitting next to you. Maybe you're even touching your leg. Touch 4 things, and again, think about shape, size, texture, right? It's 4 things. Now, uh, look at or take a moment and listen. Listen for 3 things that you can hear. Really try and listen. Really take a moment and really listen. Obviously, my voice, you're hearing my voice. But what other noises are there? Are there other noises in the room? Can you hear your laptop? Um, can you hear a baby in the other room? Can you hear a dog barking? What can you hear? And then, of course, you get the idea. We're working our way through the 5 senses, and we're counting 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The next one is 2 things that you can smell. This one's a little harder because maybe there's not a lot of smells going on, but it makes you work for it. Really makes you try and find something, right? Smell 2 things. And then last but not least, 1 thing that you can taste. And maybe it's just the inside of your mouth, but the idea is to work your way down through the 5 senses, doing 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things smell, 1 thing taste. And by the end of it, you should be a little calmer than you started, a little more grounded, a little more centered than when you started. The idea behind this exercise is to do this anytime you feel like you are experiencing that sort of like the freeze symptom of the fight, flight, or freeze. This is when you might be sort of having like an out of body experience, or you might be disassociating, right? Sometimes we get so angry, we disassociate, and we go somewhere in our minds, and people have to like sort of snap us back to reality, right? This is the idea of like snapping yourself back to reality, but doing so with your own by basically running a diagnostic, a head to toe diagnostic with your senses, all 5 of your senses. And that's the last exercise I'll leave you with. But there are lots more exercises that we can do, that I can give you, that therapists can give you, and that I think we need to be a little more well versed in, not just as Asian Americans, but as humans, human beings, as workers, as people who toil constantly in this sort of capitalist structure that we engage in. So I just want to leave you with this work, this overcoming this toxic invisibility is urgent. It is incredibly urgent because it may seem like just microaggressions. Maybe you don't even feel like you experience a lot of racism, overt racism in your daily life. But if we don't do this now, if we don't work on these things, these 3 things, these 3 strategies, then as Audre Lorde says, we will be crunched into other people's fantasies of ourselves and eaten alive. And I want to underscore that word fantasies, right? Because other people have myths and fantasies made up about us already. And if we don't challenge those and replace them with our own reality, our own stories, then they will continue and they will just get worse and worse and worse. So we need to become better storytellers. But in order to do that, we need to heal first, right? We need to heal ourselves, be able to regulate our nervous systems, and get in touch with our personal narratives before we can then share them, right? So we heal first, we share our stories and our narratives with the people around us, and then we work collaboratively with the people around us to create new processes, new culture that incorporates all of our cultures and all of our identities so that we can all be seen and heard. And this can be done immediately. Like I was saying before, you could do this right now. These exercises you could do right now. You can do them every day. You can work on healing immediately, and you can gather with your community to tell stories. And in fact, you are going to be, as I understand it, in June. And this is fantastic that you have this organization, because this organization can serve that purpose of gathering people together to share stories and to share experiences. And it looked like from the video that Jody played at the beginning that you are doing that. But I hope you continue doing that intentionally and doing that in a way with minds pointed toward this notion of changing the culture around you, right? Changing your workplace culture and maybe even the culture of the entire organization, maybe even the culture of anything beyond that, right? Society as a whole. The opportunities are endless. So I leave you with those ideas. Again, these are just my ideas. Uh, and this is, developing them as an ongoing journey for me. And I invite you to be a part of that journey. So I would love to hear your feedback, your questions, your comments, anything that came up for you during this talk. Let's 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 discuss. And if you have to drop off now, that's totally fine. Here's my contact information. I'd love to keep discussing it with you further offline. Um, and I hope you continue this conversation with each other, and that you really are intentional about overcoming the toxic invisibility that you face. Okay, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing there, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Ryan. That was so good. And all the exercises did make me feel more calmer.
Great, excellent. That's really good. Good to
Engaged
hear.
and everything. This was a really heavy subject.
Yes.
Um, but it's really, really needed, especially in our community. And actually, even I would even say um, between different sexes too, right? Because I
Oh,
think
yes.
we can relate, other races and other gender, right? Whether it's male, female type, I mean, type of thing. And then I was also thinking about like, multi-generational issues, right? Like,
Mm,
um, like we're brought up to never like um dispute,
mm-hmm,
our
mm-hmm.
elders or
Yep.
those in authority, right? We
Right.
we just take it like it is. And I mean, even, our immigration status, right? Whether um we're first generation versus like somebody that's third generation or something like that, right? Um, I
Absolutely.
just feel like um I think all of that kind of adds to, our internal, right, things that we are dealing with inside. I know I struggle with that quite a bit. And even, I mean, our personality, right? Differences in our personality being introvert versus extrovert, Um, can you kind of speak into those kinds? I know I'm throwing a lot um, about that. I don't really like, I can't really frame it in a question, but I feel like those are some of the differences that we all um, grapple with, like
Yeah.
not just Asians, right? But it's
Oh, yeah.
the differences.
Right. So, I come to this work again as an Asian American, speaking from my own experience and speaking from the experience of my community, because that's the only authority that I have. I can't speak for other communities, but I do believe that other communities can identify with a lot, if not all, of everything that I talk about, right? So just in different ways, right? So there's this fantastic phrase that they have in Southeast Asia that I really like, and I think it explains everything. And it goes like this: same, but different, right? I feel like other communities of color have same same experience, but slightly different. And yeah, it's complicated, right? It's super complicated. I think this is what you're getting at, is that it's not just that we are experiencing racist violence on the streets. There is also, you know, there's also cultural factors at play here that make us not want to challenge authority, right? It's not just that we are,
Yeah.
and it's not just that we are culturally, made to do these things. We're also fearful because of intergenerational trauma. And yeah, and everybody has different experiences, right? Like I was saying before, like whatever different generations, in this country. Like first generation people have a different experience from fourth and fifth generation people. It's all very different and incredibly complex. And you can't really encapsulate all that into one singular experience. But I do believe that it can be broadly defined as in toxic invisibility. And then we can develop, and I think these steps, these three strategies that I've developed, can help, most people, no matter what the background is. So yes, it is incredibly complex, and it sort of changes from person to person. But such is the nature of this work. We're trying to help everybody at the same time, but everybody's got a different experience.
So if you're in a meeting and you feel like, I'm waiting for a chance to speak, but I'm scared to speak too, and or if you're in a conflict situation and you back down because you're afraid you know, to speak, like what
Mhm.
are your strategies?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, the one strategy I gave for like altering the way you do meetings, that's one example. But as Asians and Asian Americans, we come from very highly collectivist cultures. I would say we're very communal people. No matter where you're from in Asia, I would say all. That's one blanket statement, one blanket generalization I would be happy to make is that I think we all come from very communalist cultures, which is again the opposite of American culture. American culture is all about individualism, right? All about the individual. So what happens is that Asian Americans get sort of separated from each other, siloed, and pitted against each other, and sort of pitted against everybody, right? You're an individual in this organization who is supposed to be looking out for yourself. You're supposed to be advocating for yourself. You're supposed to be protecting your job and doing your own job, doing your own work, head down in your own cubicle. And even in meetings, right? You're alone. You're alone, right? So I am trying to advocate for Asian Americans to return to our collectivist natures in ways that will help us, that could help us potentially in the office, maybe in the meeting room. So for example, and this is just and but just like minor ways, little tiny things that we can do, little alterations that we can do to workplace culture that will help us be seen and be heard. So for example, if you are an Asian American and you're in a meeting and you feel like you're being steamrolled or prevented from talking, maybe there's other Asian Americans in the room who might be able to help you. So maybe you're unwilling to interrupt, right? Because it seems selfish to interrupt and to start talking over somebody else. So maybe instead of interrupting for yourself, maybe you could interrupt on behalf of the other Asian American in the room. You could work together. You could help each other out. You could, and that way you are still staying true to your Asian Americanness by not interrupting for yourself. You're staying true to your Asianness by not interrupting yourself, but you are also being American by interrupting, right? So it's that combination, the cultural synthesis of these two cultural behaviors to create something that's maybe isn't done very often, where you interrupt for somebody else and you say, "Hey, uh, I think Jody over there has something she would like to say." And this can be taken into other places as well, not just in meetings, but like self-advocacy is another big thing, right? So we are expected to trumpet our own successes and brag about ourselves in order to get promoted, in order to get mentorship, in order to advance, right? They keep telling us you got to keep talking about yourself and talk about what you've done well. This is against a lot of our natures. It's against our culture to do so, right? We're taught not to brag and not to do that. We're literally taught the opposite, to put other people before ourselves, right? To say to go last, to go to lift up others. So what if we did that, but in the American workplace context? So right, instead of bragging about yourself or advocating for yourself, what if you advocated for other people and other people advocated for you? And your organization, the LA County Asian American Employees Association, is the perfect place to do that, a perfect example of how that could work. An organization that could lift each other up instead of you as individuals trying to desperately seek attention from the organization. We can lift each other up. right? So these are just small little ways that we as Asian Americans can bring our culture into the workplace in order to help ourselves be seen and heard. And to do so in a way that is not steamrolling anybody else or replacing anybody else's culture, but that works in tandem with American culture, right? So I'm not advocating for the American workplace to be flipped upside down and change everything about it. I'm saying, hey, Asian Americans, we can work with our allies in the workplace, right? If we, like for the meeting example, right, we can work with our allies to say, hey, what if we altered the structure of meetings ever so slightly? Or what if, I'm in a meeting as an Asian American and there are no other Asian Americans around, but I want to talk, but I don't want to interrupt. I can work with my allies if there are any allies in the room who can help me, who can interrupt on my behalf, right? These are small incremental changes that that I'm advocating for here.
I love that. That's so good. So spot on. I think it's easier for us to speak on behalf of someone else than for ourselves.
Right. So don't change who you are. A lot of other career development people will come in and they'll say, hey, you Asian Americans, you're too quiet. You're too quiet. You're too submissive. You need to be loud. You need to speak up and speak out. Get in there and be aggressive, right? Chop it up with everybody else. Lean in. But if that's not your nature, if that's not who you are as a person, and if that's not your culture, then that's lying to yourself, right? You'd lie to yourself in order to, you'd become somebody completely different and you'd be living a lie. And it's just not, it's for some of us, we just can't do that. It's like asking a quiet person to be loud. They can't. So I'm saying don't change who you are. Don't put away your Asianness or your Asian culture. Bring it in and bring it in ways that it can synthesize with the existing American culture, right? So, and there are ways, there are lots and lots of ways. And if we gather together more like this, and we tell our stories, and we get these stories out, we share our experiences with each other, then we can start to brainstorm and we can start to come up with ideas of how we can alter culture and change it for the better.
Yeah, and I love the storytelling idea just because you know your story. You can tell it really well because you
Yes,
experienced it, and it's easier to speak from experience, you know.
absolutely. I would love to talk about storytelling, but I just realized that I might be doing the same thing that I'm advocating against. I might be steamrolling everybody else in the room. So I want to try it. I want to try the thing that I actually recommended. I'm going to go down the list, and I'm going to call on each and every person in here to see if there's anything they would like to ask or they would like to say. I'm just going to go in order that's on my screen here. So, Young Suk Kim, is there anything that you haven't said that you would like to say? Any questions that you might have? Anything at all? Please feel free.
Actually, when you shared, resonated a lot of my immigrant life that I experienced in very white community as only either as only Asian minority
Mm,
persons and um, uh, and my childrens who were born here and I and raised by a very Korean
mm,
traditional family and cultures and since we I've been raised at the very mm, high those Confucius cultures
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
uh, uh, and respect the elders, and we do not talk and
Right.
or the we do not shows the we have to control our emotions and
Mm-hmm.
always yeah, and how they were treated and mainly white Caucasian. I do not say this by mean way, but the populations where we lived, they were the only minority or the just within 10, they can count the 10 fingers and one of them
Wow.
each school ages. And then what they went through one time that we my oldest daughter and I walked the street, and then my daughter kind of turned the face away, and then she said, "Mom, just move, let's go the other side." And then I did not know
Mm,
why she said that suddenly. And then I said, "What happened? What happened? Do you know anybody here or what?" And then she says that she never said to me. And then that a girl in front of whom she almost across, and then she said that that girl was my classmate, and I was then,
mm,
why didn't you say hi? Didn't you
mm,
glad to see her? And then no, no. And then I was so surprised, and her response was
mm,
happens. And then she said she was so very mean to me.
mm. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm,
she was very mean to me and teased me and bullied.
mm,
And I was also surprised because I raised in Korea. I mean, we are all the same Koreans. It does not mean that there was still bullies around. Maybe I did not
hmm.
recognize, but at least we are the same
Yeah.
race.
Yeah.
So
Wow. That's
yeah, and
amazing.
what my daughters and then it was not only me that there was time that we gathered Korean family. I'm one of the clergy member as well, and then we talked, and then how their children experienced what they experienced the schools, and it was very heart aching for
Mm,
first generation parents to hear, but the
mm.
children usually did not say anything much about it.
Yeah.
They kind
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
hide it, even their
Hmm.
parents. So you
That's
said,
very common.
yeah, yeah, a
That's
lot of
very common.
things. Yeah, what you shared is kind of yeah, invisibilities and never
Mm,
heard, never seen, being ignored and never been asked. I mean,
hmm.
some are very, very. I was working for the theological institution. Then some professor they were very but humanistic and were good at asking, what do you think? How do you feel? And then what I mean, encourage me to share. But the many things they are very vocal. All those professors.
Mm, hmm.
You see,
Absolutely.
and then while I was thinking, translating my Korean into English related subject, went to another part or those things. So, I mean, it brought, so I could
Yeah.
100%, 100% that I can relate it. So thank you. And then
Thank you.
definitely that when you, uh, the point is that how we can inclusive and then
Hmm.
with the relationships inviting others and then and have a good mm, working relationships as
Yes.
well as
Yes.
the making
Thank you.
yeah culture bring the culture to work together. That's
Yeah.
something. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you so much for sharing. That's I'm really happy that you're able to, it resonated with you. And thank you so much. So I'm going to move on down. I think it's funny how right when I said I'm going to call on people, a bunch of people signed off. But we've got two folks still here. So Tuya, are you there? Is there anything you would like to say?
And if you
Any
Yes, I'm
questions?
here.
feel more comfortable, I'm gonna stop the recording here and then